In breaking news, a court has finally confirmed for many of us that Justin Trudeau may in fact be a dictator that runs a dictatorial authoritarian regime. Now, I'm speaking in jest here because Justin Trudeau, of course, parades around as a leader of a free nation as Canada, this democratic nation with laws and rights and principles and freedoms that they uphold. But over the last few years, we've seen this downward spiral in Canada, as in many parts of the West, but really pronounced in Canada, where the freedom of the press is infringed upon, the freedom of individuals, the protesters, the privacy of individuals, just the bank accounts of individuals being seized for protesting against the government. Things you would see in the CCP authoritarian regime in China is very common in Canada. Now, that was very pronounced during the COVID-era pandemic, where Justin Trudeau took extraordinary actions by invoking emergency powers against protesters who had taken to the streets to show their discontent against his regime. Now, what has come out since then is a court ruling that has found that the actions taken by the Trudeau administration during that time was actually unconstitutional, in many respects illegal and unreasonable. And I'm going to get to that story in just a second. But first, I want to give you some context around the protests we saw during that time. And these were these massive convoys that we had in Canada, right? And these spread like around the world. I remember going to one in Australia that had been inspired by these protesters. And a lot of people around the world at the same time were fed up with how their governments were managing this COVID pandemic, whether it was mandates, whether it was lockdowns, whether it was just the crazy decisions they were taking based on very flimsy science at the time that people had to suffer through. The economic consequence for the individual, particularly working class families, was enormous. And we saw many governments not give a crap, especially this guy here, Justin Trudeau, who really took it to the next level by really pushing buttons and infringing on the rights of Canadians. And these truckers, they fought back, and they fought back through the democratic process of protesting. They took their anger to the streets. They blockaded the streets with their trucks, and they were doing just the basic thing that we see in Western nations all the time, which is protest. But of course, at that time, we had these, emergency powers that were being used all throughout the world, and they're predicated on the fact that it was a national health emergency, so we could do all these crazy things. But for many of us watching, it seemed illogical, right, that they could get away with this, because it was just very clearly infringing on very established basic constitutional norms and civil rights all around the West, right? Doesn't matter which Western country you come from. We knew we had these basic rights, but they were being infringed upon. Well, thanks to a Canadian court and the federal court, we have found that at least one sane judge in the world agrees with this outlook, and he has found in favor of the people, right? Let's just say for what it is, in favor of the people, in favor of the Constitution, and in favor of the rule of law. Let's have a look at this article. This is from the CBC, so state media, I believe. Ottawa's use of Emergencies Act against convoy protests was unreasonable, violated charter court rules. A federal judge says the Liberal government's use of the Emergencies Act in early 2022 to clear convoy protesters was unreasonable and infringed on protesters' charter rights. In what's already turning into a divisive decision, Federal Court Justice Richard Mosley wrote that while the protests reflected an unacceptable breakdown of public order, again, that's questionable, the invocation of the Emergencies Act does not bear the hallmarks of reasonableness, justification, transparency, and intelligibility. I conclude that there was no national emergency justifying the invocation of the Emergencies Act, and the decision to do so was therefore unreasonable and ultra vires. He wrote in a lengthy decision released Tuesday. Ultra vires in Latin term used by courts to refer to actions beyond the scope of the law. Now, typically our understanding in layman's term, if an action is beyond the scope of the law, I would say it is an illegal action. The federal court case was argued by two national groups, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association and the Canadian Constitutional Foundation, and two people whose bank accounts were frozen. They argued Ottawa did not meet the legal threshold when it invoked the legislation, which had never been used before. The federal government says it has already plans to appeal. So let's have a look at the government's response. Let's have a look at Trudeau's response, because he did send out his deputy, what's her name here, Christina Freeland, to speak to the media. And this is what she had to say when asked about this ruling.
Are aware of the court decision. We have discussed it with the Prime Minister, with cabinet colleagues, with senior federal government officials and experts. We respect very much Canada's independent judiciary. However, we do not agree with this decision, and respectfully, we will be appealing it. I would just like to take a moment to remind Canadians of how serious the situation was in our country when we took that decision. The public safety of Canadians was under threat. Our national security, which includes our national economic security, was under threat. It was a hard decision to take. We took it very seriously after a lot of hard work, after a lot of careful deliberation. We were convinced at the time, I was convinced at the time, it was the right thing to do. It was the necessary thing to do. I remain, and we remain, convinced of that. And I'll now turn it over to...
So yeah, you can see Christina Freeland here, the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada. They're not backing down. They're sticking by the decisions they made. And we've heard this type of rhetoric before from leaders all around the world. This is a justification that they give. National emergency, national security threat, economic threats, all this kind of stuff that they had to take actions for public health and safety. Now, of course, we've seen recently that a lot of the decisions that they made were predicated on absolute nonsense. Right, I can openly say that now. We've seen that very clearly. Even then, many of us suspected this and said this very clearly based on evidence and just natural, logical reasons that we could see just appearing right in front of our eyes that these people were choosing to ignore when they enacted these type of emergency powers. But here they are again, just using the same excuses. And I think the baseline here of this whole issue is the fact that regardless of what these leaders say and what they think, there are certain fundamental rights and protections in constitutions around the world in the West, and there are fundamental civil rights that usually transcend all of this. And the threshold to use these emergency powers, the threshold to seize people's bank accounts, right, for protesting in the West, really, the threshold for that has to be a very high bar. And I believe from what I've read of this judgment and the commentary around it, this judge at this federal court that ruled against this regime and the government has found that they didn't really meet this threshold. There was already other laws and things in place in districts or the counties or whatever that could potentially deal with these protesters. And the fact that they invoked these emergency powers was uncalled for. Now, Justin Trudeau was caught up with by Rebel News. They had a reporter that was able to track him down as he was exiting, and this is what they said to him.
Mr. Trudeau, the federal court has ruled that the Emergencies Act was unconstitutional. Would you resign or apologize to Canadians for violating their rights?
I mean, look, it's a fair question. Would you resign or apologize to Canadians? I think an apology is a must, but resignation is definitely warranted, especially if they infringed on people's rights unconstitutionally, as this federal court judge has found in many respects. And even though he didn't answer the questions there and he sent out his deputy to face the media, you can see that sly little look that he gives as he's walking in. He knows he's a culprit. He's always known Mr. Blackface, but he's never been held accountable. And you're finding now through his court decisions that luster around him, even potentially from his own support base, is being diminished. Now, I want to go back to this court ruling and get more details into what it actually means, because a few people have asked me these questions, because I think that the worry amongst a lot of people is that, yes, okay, great, there's a court ruling, they won't be held accountable, nothing will come of this. What does this actually mean? Does this mean that Justin Trudeau ends up spending time in jail? As much as that would be excellent to see him in jail, no, that's not going to happen. I highly doubt there's ever going to be a scenario where that happens to these leaders involved during that time, because they all protect themselves. But what this does mean is that these type of rulings, especially on appeal if it's lost, is that the multiple cases that are against the government for people whose rights were infringed, for people who were arrested, for people whose bank accounts were seized, for any type of infringements on people's rights during that time, and they have a case against the government, it will strongly back up those cases. It also sets somewhat of a precedent to future governments not to act in this regard and use these emergency powers willy-nilly as they please, because there has to be a threshold that has to be met. And you can't just decide to use it because it's the most convenient and easiest thing to do. So I think it's good to establish those type of norms. And even though right now that Justin Trudeau and his crew might not face any type of justice for what they've done, and they're going to sail off into the sunset as many other leaders like Jacinda Ardern here in New Zealand and Daniel Andrews here in Victoria and Scott Morrison, all these people have done, and their lives continue on despite the fact that they've destroyed many lives with their actions. There is going to be future protections for people and some justice for those people who are taking the government on in the courts. Now, one of the institutions involved in taking this to the courts is the Canadian Constitution Foundation, and this is what they wrote. The Canadian Constitution Foundation is thrilled that Justice Mosley of the Federal Court of Canada has accepted the CCF's arguments that the invocation of the Emergencies Act in response to the Freedom Convoy protest was unreasonable and violated the Charter rights to expression and security against unreasonable searches and seizures. In a judicial review decision released Tuesday, Justice Mosley agreed with the CCF that Cabinet's invocation of the Act on February 2022 was not reasonable for two reasons. First, Cabinet did not properly account for the requirement under Section 3 of the Act that emergencies only be declared where a situation cannot be effectively dealt with under any other law of Canada. Due to its nature and the broad powers it grants the federal executive, the Emergencies Act is a tool of last resort, Justice Mosley wrote. The GIC cannot invoke the Emergencies Act because it's convenient or because it may work better than other tools at their disposal or available to the provinces. Second, the requirement of reasonable grounds to believe that Canada faced threats to the security of Canada has not been met. Section 17 of the Act states that threats to the security of Canada has the same meaning as it has under Section 2C of the Canadian Security Intelligence Services Act, which includes threats like terrorism, espionage, and attempts to overthrow the government. Justice Mosley said that this does not include the economic disruption that resulted from the border crossings, blockades, troubling as they were. I think it's a very important point. There's this insistence now by governments that as soon as people in their own nations protest against them, that it is an act of terrorism against the broader population. And that's not the case. People disrupting the workings of government, disrupting society in general, economic disruption through protests, is a Western tradition, whether we like it or not. We're seeing right now all around the world all manner of protests which are being tolerated by governments in the West, even though it's causing economic disruption. These are fundamental rights which are somewhat protected by constitutions and just by basic our civil rights to disagree with government and show them our displeasure by this act of peaceful assembly and protesting. Yes, there are instances where violence might break out, where threats might happen, where people's safety potentially is at an immediate risk. But if it can't be borne out and shown that those thresholds are being met and it's just people protesting and it's making a problem for the government, that doesn't necessarily rise to the level of terrorism as being indicated by the arguments of the government, especially around things like national security. I mean, these are people having a domestic issue, protesting against their government, wanting to see a change. And instead of responding to that, what did Trudeau do? He shut people down. He sent in the police to beat people up, and he seized people's bank accounts. So this rebuke from this this judge, is great in my opinion. Now, there is much more assessments which are going to come from this particular case and much more commentary that's going to be found in this case. And I am by no means an expert in Canadian law, so there'll be many other experts that you can probably look into to get a more finer, detailed understanding. But I just wanted to provide this for those audiences around the world who are looking at this scenario and thinking, gosh, why isn't this happening in my country, right? Why isn't the Australian courts taking this more seriously? And it's a shame. I think our courts have really let us down in this country. They had so many opportunities in Australia to actually listen to some of these cases and, force the government to explain their decisions, force the government to show their findings, and they've failed on each occasion. So it's great to see a judge and a justice here actually stand on the side of the law and common sense and reason and hold the government accountable for just very illogical actions that they took during that time. Anyway, guys, my name is Rukshan Fernando. If you're enjoying this, you can subscribe to my channel at The Real Rukshan on YouTube. Hit that notification bell so you get updates. I do a daily news vlog, so you can catch up with that as well every day. In the meantime, you can also follow me on Instagram, X, Rumble, Odyssey, YouTube, and what else is there? I don't know. There's so many social media apps now at The Real Rukshan. See you guys next time.